Reformation, right? We talked about pastoralism already. One of the things that we're going to see come from this, though, is that because agriculture and pastoralism are going to start to generate more consistent food sources, right? Because people are no longer having to worry about eating, right, or where their food's coming from, it's going to allow certain groups within those societies to start to specialize their labor, right? To start doing things that weren't food production. And so we'll start to see the first potters, the first weavers, the first kings, the first priests start to emerge within these societies. And it's also during this time that we'll start to see people figure out how metallurgy works, right? It turns out that if you're not always on the go, you have time to stop around and think about stuff, right? And somebody at some point probably accidentally melted a rock in a fire and then found out that it was metal, right? And then figured out how to do that stuff. We're not really sure how it starts, but that's one of the things that they think, right? But this, what we see is this transition from a constantly mobile society to a stationary lifestyle, right? Where folks aren't picking up and moving all the time. Right, because food sources are now easy to obtain, population grows, right? We see this all the time. Whenever you have a food surplus, population will grow. Right, for units 1 through 5, that is an absolute truth. Unit 6, it gets a little... Our population in the U.S., for instance, is growing, but not in numbers. Food surplus. We're actually having fewer kids than we did in the last unit. Right? But one of the biggest changes to human society that comes from the sedentary lifestyle, from the creation of agriculture, is the development of a patriarchal society. Right? Farming is hard work, physically hard work. And so men began to dominate it. Right, and as a result, because women lost status in terms of their food collection, so I believe that that's what created the genesis of the patriarchal society, right, where men are going to start to dominate things based on their increased role within society, or the increased significance of their role in society. All right. So our first civilizations that'll pop up, right, are first real big ones, right? So when we talk about the Neolithic Revolution popping up in the Fertile Crescent, what we're talking about at first is like some farming villages, right? But eventually these villages will start to coalesce into huge societies, right? And the weird thing is it's going to happen all over the world at roughly the same time, historically speaking, without them being able to contact each other, right? So the first place that this happens is in Mesopotamia, right, along the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. These early civilizations, while they will share a culture, they will be independent of one another, right? So in Mesopotamia, we see the development of city-states, right? These cities that were polities all of their own. Mesopotamia will see the development of Hammurabi's Code, the first legal system we're aware of. Right, the first example of codified law we're aware of. Right, we learn a lot from this. One, that they had, codified law, right? That they had a writing system, right? But also that Mesopotamian society was highly structured, right? That there was social stratification there. That there was a difference between free man, poor man, and slave. Right, or landowner, poor man, and slave, right? That there was a difference between men and women, that there was a difference between adult and child, by the way that their punishments were meted out, right? And if a landowner did this thing, then he was forced to pay a fine. If a poor man did this thing, then he might have his eye gouged out. If a slave did this thing, then this would be his punishment, right? Bless you. Right, the writing system they're going to use is cuneiform. It's the oldest writing system we're familiar with, right? It's a series of wedges that they would dig into clay tablets. Right? But this allows them to store knowledge. It also allows for the creation of a new profession, the scribe. All right, so we're also going to see the Mesopotamian religion is going to be polytheistic, and they're going to build these huge monumental structures called ziggurats. These are large temples that are used to worship. Right, so these temples were big platforms, right? They're different than the pyramids that we'll see in Egypt. Right, the difference between a pyramid and a ziggurat is that you go on top of a ziggurat, you go into a pyramid. Right, so the ziggurat stood as a platform for priests to get closer to the gods. In Egypt, we're going to see another civilization arise along the banks of the Nile River. Right. Unlike in Mesopotamia, we're going to see a highly centralized government. Egyptians will have their own writing style. This will be called hieroglyphics. Right? This is a pictographic style of writing, meaning that there were images that meant ideas. Right? As opposed to our writing style, right? Ours is a phonetic writing style, meaning that our symbols represent a sound. Hieroglyphs, pictographic writing styles, their symbols represented a concept. Yeah?
Is cuneiform pictographic?
No. Yeah. Right. In Egypt, they were our first theocracy. Right. Our first large theocracy. Right. Some of the early Mesopotamian city-states were also theocratic, but for the Egyptians, we're looking at our first big centralized theocracy. The pharaoh wasn't just king; he was also he was also a god. Right. And when those gods would die, they'd be buried in their tombs, right, their pyramids, so that they could take a whole bunch of stuff and people with them to the afterlife. All right, with Egypt, we see our first examples of interregional trade, right? The Egyptians and the Nubians to their south, trading with great frequency. Egypt was interested in Nubia's gold. So much so that eventually they just took Nubia. Some of our other civilizations that are in the Middle East before we move on. These would be later civilizations, but we're going to see the Hittites pop up in the Middle East. These are our first, they're going to be in what is today Turkey, right? Anatolia, or Asia Minor, right? They're our first developers of iron metallurgy. These guys will also invent the chariot. They become important not only for their interactions in Mesopotamia, but also with the Egyptians, but because they're going to be the ones that spread that technology to those areas, right? They're the ones that are going to introduce iron metallurgy. They're the ones that are going to give the Egyptians chariots. I don't mean they're going to give them. They're like, hey, Egypt, here's a chariot, enjoy. No, but that's how it transmits to them, right? We're also going to see in Mesopotamia an empire form, right? These are the Babylonians. Right? So eventually some of the city-states are going to join together. They're going to start to conquer the other city-states, forming a large empire within Mesopotamia, right? So it's our first big empire, meaning that it's a conquering of other lands, right? Most famous king that we get out of Babylon is going to be Nebuchadnezzar. Not a type of wine. Yeah, you guys don't remember that? There were folks that were on the first guided reading they didn't read the words they were writing down. There's a really bad wine that's called Nebuchadnezzar. And rather than thinking, some folks just typed in the word Nebuchadnezzar and started writing. That's the problem when you read one letter at a time, as opposed to the whole thing. Right? Problem. Right? But Nebuchadnezzar is famous because he does what? What's that? Say again, Drew? Yeah, so he's the one that will lead the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, right? Basically, the king of Judea will piss him off, and he'll go in and just wreck their face, and he'll exile the Jews from Jerusalem, creating the first Jewish diaspora, right? Which is really why we care about him for this class, right? Is that this is the first dispersal of the Jewish people, or of the people that will become the Jews. These are Israelites. There's a small but technical difference. Right, yeah, there we go. Right. The other big ones that we're going to get here are the Phoenicians. These guys are not like the others, right? So even when we start talking about these other first empires that pop up, the Phoenician Empire was navally based, right? So they were going to spread across the Mediterranean, right, by way of boats. Right, we know the Phoenicians for a couple things, right? Not only did they stand out for that, but they do two things. One, they invent the color purple for clothing. They're the ones that figure out how to make purple dye. This seems weird to us now, is why that would be really important. But what it does is it makes them super rich, because they're the only ones in the area that know how to make it. So everybody that wants clothing that's the color purple has to buy it from Phoenicia. Right, so they get super rich off of that. The other reason why we know them is because of their alphabet. Right? They have a purely phonetic alphabet. And they're where we get the name phonetic from. All right, so. Oh yeah, perfect. There we go. All right, so in South Asia, right, along the border of what is today Pakistan and India, right, along the banks of the Indus River, we'll see the creation of the Indus River Valley civilizations. Right, these are decentralized city-states, just like we saw in Mesopotamia. The most famous of the two are Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. These are amazing little city-states. Right? We know they're polytheistic from the things that we found, right? The little trading seals that they would use depicted various gods. But we don't have a decipherable language, right? We never discover, a Rosetta Stone, as it were. Right? Like that's how we learned how to decipher Egyptian. Is that the Romans at one point, once they had conquered Egypt, put together a big signpost that was written in Latin, Greek, and Egyptian. It was just saying the same things over and over. And once we read it in Latin and read it in Greek and understood that it's the same message, we were then able to determine how to read hieroglyphics. Right? We got enough words on that it's basically a sign for the government, right? You will do these things, right? It's a public decree. And so we were able to get enough words to figure out Egyptian. We never find that kind of a thing for the Indus River Valley. So we're completely at a loss for how they, what they wrote. But this is a complex society early on, right? They're gonna, not only do they have things like working sewer systems and a pretty advanced idea about city planning in terms of being able to manipulate how the wind flows through, right, to make sure that the city is bearable. But they also will engage in interregional trade. We're going to find, Indus River Valley trading seals in Mesopotamia. We're going to find Mesopotamian bronze in the Indus River Valley. But then some sort of natural disaster happens. Some people think it's a meteor. Other people think there was an earthquake. Some people think it was an earthquake caused by a meteor. But for whatever happened, or for whatever caused the event, the Indus River Valley will shift, or excuse me, Indus River will shift, and that will cause them a lot of problems and basically cause the collapse of their culture. Right? In China, or what is today China, we'll see the development of the Yellow River civilization. Right, the Yellow River, or the Huanghe. Right, the first big dynasty that we care about. Right, there's some other ones that we think may have existed. We're not 100% sure. Right, but the first one that we know for sure happened was the Shang dynasty. Right, this is a centralized government, and it is theocratic. Right, it's theocratic because the Shang kings acted as go-betweens. Right, they were intermediaries between the heavens and the earth. Right, and so what they had to do is they had to practice divination. They would do this with oracle bones. They would take tortoise shells or animal bones and cast them into fires until they began to crack, and then they would interpret the cracks that were in the bone as a means of determining the future. Right, this is where we'll begin to see a couple trademark characteristics of China, right, or a couple standout characteristics of Chinese society, right. The first of these is going to be ancestor worship. Right, this is where this begins. Remember, this is an important aspect of Chinese culture, right? It's why Catholicism will never take root in China. Right? It's because they got hung up on this ancestor worship, right? You know, a couple thousand years later. We're going to see the basis for the Chinese writing system begin here. Chinese is both phonetic and pictographic. Meaning that its symbols represent both sounds and concepts. The Shang dynasty will be followed by the Zhou dynasty. It is centralized and it is feudal. Right? Meaning that power is shared, that we get that relationship. Remember, anytime we see that word feudal, we're talking about relationships where we are exchanging land for military service, right? Or work for military protection. The Zhou dynasty will be the first of the Chinese to use iron metallurgy, right? They'll develop this. Iron is better than bronze for tools and weapons, right? And it'll give them a distinct advantage against their neighbors. And because the Zhou are going to replace the Shang kings, who were, according to Chinese culture at the time, the intermediaries between the gods and the people on earth, the Zhou had to come up with some reason for why it was okay for them to get rid of the Shang, right? Because if the gods had chosen the Shang kings to rule and to act as the go-betweens, then killing them posed a serious problem for the Chinese people. So as a way to explain that, they come up with the mandate of heaven, right? That the Shang kings have begun to act and rule unjustly. And so the gods, so they lost their mandate from the heavens, and the gods wanted them to be overthrown. So the Zhou came in, overthrew them, and now they had the mandate of heaven.